All right.
Okay.
Um, that is a question that people do debate whether or not the government can respond to people quicker, um, and it has pros and cons. But the pros are pretty limited, and the cons are, in my view, very outstanding. One of them being that the government's main interest is stability, and this is known, this is written, and stability being status quo being no change whatsoever. So a lot of the times they can see kind of what the people are about to do beforehand, and yes, take security measures to stop that, quell that. A good example is recently with Occupy Wall Street, and then later Occupy everything. You have cities across LA, San Francisco, Memphis, Miami, New York, all around. What was interesting was that Yahoo blocked any type of message or link that included Occupy with a city's name after it. Um, they released a press release saying that this was incidental by mistake, but it leaves someone who is an activist to only question. The same instance goes for Mubarak knocking out the internet. That was obviously purposeful to stop the revolution. So is it used for them to actually answer the questions? I don't believe so. I believe that a lot of the problems that we face today in society, a lot of the protests and activists that are out there, that information is on the web, and governments do have access to it. But they're not going to pay mind to it until it becomes something real, something on the streets, and that's where people have power, and that's where the government will step in.
So what do you know about WikiLeaks? And is it Asante? Is that how you pronounce his name? Being in
Assange,
Assange,
Julian Assange.
yes, being involved in the whole have being that WikiLeaks is kind of like a whistleblower thing, and it's not exactly a credible source, and it releases information that the government tries to keep from us in order to quote unquote keep us safe. How does that harm or help the revolution, and if so, how?
As far as helping the revolution, I don't think it's a tremendous reason why we have a revolution today, or in the Middle East, or in Europe for that matter. People have values that they go by. These people on the streets, these activists, and they've been activists well before WikiLeaks was established. So I wouldn't give credibility to WikiLeaks for the people out here. As far as, is it his right to allow this transparency of governments? Arguable. I mean, you have to look at it from this sense. If he's going to release these documents with diplomats' names, for one instance, was making fun of the president of Russia and who he walks around with, or the president of Iran. A lot of these documents weren't high-level security documents. It was technically really equal to gossip at the diplomatic level. Who people were seen at meetings with, what they were doing during the day, just thoughts that the diplomats had. It wasn't high security level types of clearance. So as far as threatening United States security, very arguable if anyone was jeopardized besides the diplomats' names that were not blacked out. I think that is something wrong. I think that Assange has to, if he wants to be looked at as a credible source, follow the regulations and guidelines of what a journalist must do. And if the source wasn't given to you by a person, you should list them as anonymous and take out those names. So I feel there he is wrong, but on the same token, what he's been releasing isn't high-level types of information that I think people can die from.
So WikiLeaks, is that relevant or irrelevant to the Arab Spring, and is Facebook and Twitter more influential than WikiLeaks?
Yeah, well, here's the whole thing about WikiLeaks. If you go and type in wikileaks.org, .net, whatever it is, you're not going to be able to find it. It's a website that is shut down daily and then is rewrote through another proxy. So it's always moving. So the amount of people that are actually reading WikiLeaks documents is much fewer than what you would think. It's very savvy, internet savvy, technology savvy people. So on that hand of accessibility, Twitter and Facebook are much more easy to access. And even the information that he's putting out, the diplomatic cables, military cables, if you're not in the military and you haven't been in the military for years, some of the information he's releasing would make no sense. as far as the abbreviations go, the code words, how you speak. The average person can't use it as an information source. So no, I wouldn't say that it at all played a role in the Arab Spring. I think regardless of WikiLeaks, these people knew what was going on in their communities firsthand, not through a secondary source, and especially not through a secondary source that was dealing with the elite, the diplomats, the military. These are everyday people with everyday problems. Yes, it does point out corruption within the government, but those people would have been at those streets regardless of whether they knew what diplomats were saying at the higher end.
Okay. So is there anything that you want to add or that I didn't ask about that is important to know about the Arab Spring and what's going on in the Middle East?
Well, interestingly, with the Arab Spring, and it's also been said here in media circles as Occupy gets larger and larger, is the demands, the direction. A lot of media and media pundits point to the fact that the Occupy Wall Street, Occupy US doesn't have a ringing call as the revolutions in the Middle East did. Revolutions in the Middle East asking for regime change, flat and basic, and it was out there. And they point to that as one of the faults of Occupy. But I think that what needs to be really shown is two things. First, the actual coverage of it. If you look today, what's been on your morning news, what's been on the front page of many newspapers is the Michael Jackson trial. And this is not ironic, this is not a coincidence. This is something that happens often. It happens with anything that the news doesn't want to cover, they have to find another story. So you have occupies around the country with thousands, tens of thousands of people marching, yet you cover a court case on a man who's dead. Not taking anything away from him, but that's one thing that is hard to stomach as someone who is involved in that. Secondly is the asking for demands of Occupy, and that there's no leader to the movement. And I think today, in today's revolutions, that's something that's signature of it. You look to the Egyptian Revolution, and you see you had people playing roles from across the board of activism. You have the feminists there. You had the environmentalists there. You had the Muslim Brotherhood there. You had libertarians. You had the unemployed. You had people who were affected by the corrupt regime and who had family members killed or kidnapped. So you had a whole spectrum of complaints. Yes, down with the regime was the rallying call, but people were there with different agendas. And where their power was from was that they didn't cater to any one agenda, but kept it a broad-based solution so that everyone could be included. Now, come to the US, it's almost the same type. There's the rallying call. I am the 99%. 1% of the population has 40% of the wealth. The system is broke. That's the rallying call. And to move that to anything more specific would be to push out the environmental groups, to push out the gay and lesbian groups, to push out the Republicans, the Democrats, because this movement finds its power in flexibility. It finds its focus is there is no focus. And as soon as they make a focus, you will alienate people. And the beautiful thing about it is that it is very inclusive and that they can rally around any cause. Now, you look at the media, they say they're disorganized, they're a bunch of hippies. But what's interesting is if this is the case, how do they do it? It's nationwide, it's organized, they have committees, they clean, they give blankets, they give food. It's very organized. And I think that's one thing the media isn't doing a good job of, is talking to the informed people who are organizing, but are actually singling out the uninformed people who come there for the day. And it's giving the movement a certain type of look, if someone isn't really looking at it closely in detail, of the type of people that are down there. Interestingly enough, though, you see as it comes, this is something you always learn in political science, is the states that govern the people are only as powerful as the people make them. So if a person comes out there in force, even the largest military dictatorship can fall. And that's what you had in Egypt. A lot of people forget that we do live in a militarized state, and police are there in riot gear, and they're not afraid to swing their clubs. They're not afraid to shoot tear gas. They're not afraid to leave people there
who haven't done anything but peacefully protest and assemble legally. And I think that when you have conflict, you see the contradictions of government. It does point it out. And even if they're not calling for a political change, or they're not abiding by the political rules of having a leader, it might be because historically when movements had leaders, those leaders seem to, get assassinated, shot? I'm speaking in JFK, I'm speaking in Martin Luther, I'm speaking in Malcolm X. When movements were given a head, they're much easier to deal with. You can follow one man, see where he lives. Can you follow a million? Well, that's when you get into the discussion of internet control and being able to look at Facebooks, being able to look at Twitter accounts, being able to control information. And that's when you have, still today, when they have the General Assembly meetings in New York, they're not read off an iPad, they're read off a piece of paper, crinkly, written with ink. So it kind of comes full circle as to what this is. At the end of the day, it's everyday people with everyday problems. And it is the government's obligation to address those problems. And they haven't addressed them. So people are now looking for a new route to address them. And that is in popular protest. And the U.S. has a long history of popular protest. It's nothing new. It's not a coincidence that we don't know much about this popular protest past the civil rights. We had protests right after the Revolutionary War that the government we put in wasn't right. And that's how we got the Constitution. You had huge protests in the early 50s for civil rights, but those were quelled by the Civil War. You had huge protests for women looking for suffrage. You have huge protests for workers and laborers who are building the railroads that connect our land today. A lot of that's blacked out, but what these protests are doing, and what every revolution does, it draws back on those past experiences. It lets the past live, but you learn from that past. And I think them not adopting a focus immediately is because they have learned where other movements have failed, which is to establish one leader, to establish one cause, because it limits yourself to who you can draw in, and the power is in the masses. And the government knows this, and this is why they keep asking for one type of demand, because they know that if the demand is higher wages for people, if the demand is less racism, if the demand is environment, then you'll alienate whoever doesn't fall under that cause. And that's the beauty of revolution. It's inclusive. And as soon as it becomes exclusive, it's no longer popular revolution, but just a political agenda.
Good stuff. Thanks.